Right, instead of rambling on, Tom, let me start by just saying a big thank you to you for giving up some of your time this Wednesday morning and joining us for a show of The Responsible Edge. I know you're a particularly busy chap with all that you've got on, but thank you for finding the time to fit us in.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm really delighted to be here and flattered to be invited, Charlie. So thank you for having me.
Top man, top man. Well, Tom, as you well know, as we've spoken about before, the first kind of area that we jump into on an episode of The Responsible Edge is looking into you and your background and understanding a bit more about the experience that you've been through. Pulling on kind of, you know, those inspiration points, those motivations, those pivots that you've made, etc., and start wherever you like as well. I mean, we do have some guests who really do take us back to the real origins of things in early childhood and things like that. Feel free to start wherever you like, but give our listeners a flavor as to who you are and what you've done to date in your career.
Yes, of course. Well, thank you. It's always quite nice to sit around and talk about yourself a little bit. I guess to sort of, in a way, sort of begin at the beginning. You know, I read philosophy at university, and I have to be honest, like a lot of callow youths had maybe come away feeling slightly disillusioned and, more importantly, unsure about really what I wanted to do with my professional life. So I'm probably revealing my age a little bit here, but I remember very distinctly sitting and watching 9/11 unfold live on TV. Arguably, I mean, obviously a terrible tragedy, but also a profoundly sort of postmodern and unusual experience to see probably one of the most significant world events as a spectacle in a way. And then all the things that followed from that. So particularly Stop the War protests and the level of engagement and anger that I think people were feeling at the time. And I felt very strongly that actually, if you want to be part of shaping a better world, you need to actually get involved. Protest is well and good, and there's definitely a place for it, but really you need to take some time to try and be the change and be involved in the change. So with my callow youth outlook and a slight sense of shock about what was going on in the world, I decided to try and join the government to become a civil servant, which is what I did. I took on a policy role, working in the cabinet office initially, and I really, that was my particular aim as the outset of my career. And I was very lucky in that I fell into working in sustainable development, as we referred to it back then, and took on a policy job working particularly on that topic area. And I worked for government for quite a long time, but became slightly disillusioned with the short-term thinking, which is incumbent on politicians sort of as a necessary component of electoral cycles. I mean, we've seen it quite recently in the run-up to the most recent general election. And, the UK's arguably leading position on climate issues, slightly falling away with the sense that there might be some votes to be won by stepping back from some important, what I felt were important policy decisions. So I really had to come to a decision I felt in my own career about whether I wanted to continue on that path in government or whether I really wanted to focus my career around sustainability. And in the end, I plumped for the latter. I was invited to go and work for JLL. It's a large global real estate company with a particular focus on initially ESG reporting and disclosure, supporting investor relations, that side of things. And I had a great sort of 8 years or so there. Really fascinating time working on a whole range of issues, but sort of ultimately finishing up leading the net zero target development. So JLL was one of the first 7 companies in the world to have a science-based net zero goal, and really, fascinating piece of work, a lot of complexity, but really sort of touching on all areas of the business and its engagements with its clients. And then 2 years ago, I left JLL and I now work for Carter Jonas. I'm the head of sustainability. We're a multidisciplinary property business operating in the UK. We deal with a very broad range of different asset types, everything from country estates and forests through to large national infrastructure projects, industrial, commercial, residential, and then within that providing a sort of full spectrum of property services. So a very, I guess, similar but very different proposition from being at JLL. Much more intersection with the natural world, which is quite interesting. Yeah, and bringing its own range of challenges as well. So we're making good progress, but as ever, a lot more to do.
Tom, that was an absolutely brilliant nutshell synopsis introduction to you, and cramming, such an impactful career into such a concise introduction. I'm going to take you way back though. I want to peer into and go and sort of nestle around at different stages. So I want to go back to university. You're studying philosophy. You mentioned activism. Were you involved in activism during your days at university?
No, I'd like to say yes, but no. The answer is really no. To be honest, but I think certainly just my own process and journey around philosophy, and I guess that it's really, for me, at any rate, a sort of a sense of self-awareness and peeling back of layers to understand really who you really are and what is really important to you. So I think it was more a journey of self-discovery rather than necessarily one of activism. But I say that I've always, ever since I was a child, I have had a love of the natural world. I grew up. Hole in the ozone layer was a big issue. We had to throw our cans of Lynx Africa away until they made them CFC free. So
God, do
environmental.
you remember? Just Tom, just
Yes,
to interrupt. Do you remember how terrible we all smelt? Didn't we? We all just had that same Lynx Africa smell. There was just that like teenage boy smell of Lynx Africa. That was just synonymous, wasn't it, with being
yeah.
that age?
My children becoming teenagers, there's a pot of Lynx Africa shower gel in the bathroom. I have to be honest with you, but yeah, it's certainly a thing. It still is a thing. So yeah.
Very good. And okay, so that's really interesting. So your time at university was, as you say, that kind of all about that sort of self exploration and understanding a bit more about what mattered to you and what where you wanted to point your energy, where you wanted to direct your energy and your time, and then the decision to go into government, was there a real sort of a sense of, I want to do something dutiful, or what was just talk us through like the real direct inspiration that led you to go, that's what I want to
Sure.
focus on.
Yeah, I mean, it all sounds faintly ridiculous talking about it now, but I mean, I certainly, at that point in my life, I couldn't really see myself do it. I was always very envious of my friends who were able to see a sort of vocational route that, to their careers, whether they're doctors or lawyers or, people who felt very certain about what they wanted to do. That was never particularly clear to me. And it probably wasn't very clear to me at all, even when I'd finished university. But I'd always had an interest in politics. In a way, it's sort of the practical application of philosophy, if I can put it that way. So I was attracted to go and do that. But I wanted to feel, like I say, that I was in some small way contributing to actually what was happening in the world, rather than doing something which was solely focused on, profit for profit's sake, or was entirely, as I say, I was a callow youth, entirely self-indulgent as I saw it back then. So that was really, I think, my motivator to sort of, be part of what was going on in the world in a broader sense.
And I'm really fascinated when talking to people like yourself who dare I say it, have almost sort of been there from the beginning, if you like, of the, and I'm going to use huge generalizations here, but the sustainability agenda, if you like, and the sort of formation of it. You mentioned that it was referred to within government as sustainable development. Can you just reflect for our listeners on kind of what the kind of key focuses were for you working within government on sustainable development at that time?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think government sometimes gets a bit of a bad rap, but I mean, really, government departments, they've been looking at becoming more sustainable for a long time. When I joined 20 years, it's about 20 years ago now, and that these targets are still around there, the greening government commitments in place, they've become probably more robust, more aligned to sort of science and best practice. But there has been a push for a long time to improve sustainability in government, to support, data collection, reporting, trying to build things into strategy and look at the way these organizations operate. There's multiple benefits that it's not necessarily just about climate change. It's also about cost efficiency, value for the taxpayer, all these other good things that flow from that. So, we were, looking particularly at the operation of the built estate and improving that. Fleet, interesting pieces on air travel, which I'm probably not allowed to talk about even now. But it was largely looking at how you translate a long-term goal and target into something which is operationally deliverable, and how you measure and monitor progress against that. So really, it's kind of bread and butter for many sustainability professionals working in organizations all over the world. But I do feel the government doesn't necessarily give itself sufficient credit. There was, if you remember, the greenest government ever, Charlie, those heady days when the coalition came in, and there was a significant push at that time from the Prime Minister for departments to up their game. And I remember the carbon target was very incremental. It was sort of 1 or 2% per annum, and the directive was we're going to do 10% in a year. Which people felt was frankly a bit bonkers, but it was delivered. And it's amazing what a bit of will and leadership can do to actually drive progress in organizations. So,
but Tom, and it's a very, very well made point. And I do recall now the Clegg Cameron axis and essentially the way that they position themselves. You get to this point though, working in government, as you say, where the short-termism associated with the whole kind of political system here in the UK just became tiresome, and you were disillusioned with it. I'm really interested, when you moved into JLL, what were like the number one kind of, because you'd never worked in the corporate world before that point. So what were the most sort of surprising, revealing kind of experiences that you went through when you transitioned into your role at JLL?
I think really the importance of the investor community in driving sustainability, or ESG, as they refer to it, or we refer to it. Terms are always a bit hard to define, but actually having conversations with major investors and really understanding that this was something that was fundamentally important in their sort of capital allocation decisions, and that really at the end of the day for them it's about risk, and that is completely reshaping, or has reshaped, the business landscape in a way that maybe, I guess, non-shareholder owned businesses or public sector organizations are perhaps a little bit insulated from. But how that's created change in a fairly rapid fashion, which has only really accelerated, I think, over the last decade. That was remarkable. I think there are obviously structural challenges in all businesses, and this isn't always the case, but the way that business leaders can come together and be agile and really move quickly and be agents for change really struck me too. So it was a very positive experience, I think, on the whole.
And was that sense of, because if you're coming out of government feeling, disheartened, but maybe disheartened is the right word, with the short-termism, was the fact that you were now in this kind of agile, adaptable environment that perhaps was also able to think a little bit more long-term about, and I know we're going to talk about the article today that obviously alludes to this more long-term thinking, but was that something that you experienced, that you thought, actually, this is more, this is the runway that I want to settle myself into?
Yeah, I think so. I guess something else I would say, there's, we're going to talk about this in the articles you referred to, but I think the ESG reporting ecosystem that exists for those types of businesses, like it or hate it, it sets a very clear set of expectations for organizations. So there is a common understanding of what good looks like, which is massively helpful. because sustainability it can be very confusing. But actually being able to say, well, look, we know what we're trying to achieve. And first it was, net zero, but then you have to say, well, what do you mean by that? But then you're like, well, here's an agreed standard definition of that. Then aligning to climate science, science-based targets, for example. But actually working together, collaborating to build that understanding and then driving to deliver on it, I think is really key. But we're going to talk about business strategy, I'm sure, and actually how you bring in that long-term view around sustainable change into business strategy as an opportunity to create value for your organization and for your stakeholders. I think that's really the key piece.
And was that, out of interest, just touching on that, in terms of is there a greater degree of satisfaction for you in the roles that you've taken on at JLL and at Carter Jonas, in terms of being able to see like the value impact of the work that you're doing directly from a sustainability perspective?
I think so. I mean, this is again one of the challenges. Is it can be quite intangible. They may be, your graph goes a little bit more in the right direction, if that makes any sense. But actually, I think recognition from peers and stakeholders and those sort of ratings they do. It is a good feeling to see continuous improvement happening, and ultimately, you're being able to realize value for your organization, like I say. So, I mean, something perhaps that's a bit more tangible. We worked at JLL to link the performance of elements of the company's net zero goal into the borrowing rates for the company, the credit facility.
Very cool.
So it was only one bip one way or another, but actually that then becomes something that it has a direct financial bearing on the operation of the business, and putting the right sort of incentives in place to drive change as well. So completing bits of work which are, I guess, in a small way, slightly pioneering in some sense. That's really, I think, where I get my satisfaction from.
And does that then sort of, thinking back to the beginning of your career and going into government, you mentioned that you were seeking something that felt like it had a real, taking part in resolving the situations and being a contributor towards the, improving things, essentially. Has moving into the corporate world and being able to work on the likes of that initiative at JLL, has that given you that same sense of impact in terms of the work that you've done?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and I guess to frame it a bit, my general philosophy is, if you're doing something positive, no matter how small, you are contributing to improving it. So I'm not trying to suggest I'm changing the world or anything, but I like to think that all of these things that countless professionals in countless organizations are working to deliver, we're all coming together to actually create this change. So I think, so I mean, the credit facility is a great example. Like I say, relative to the operational budget of the business, it's not a huge amount of money. But what it is I guess, a proof of concept, if you like, that these types of arrangements can work, they can drive change, they can be mutually beneficial for both the lender and the client. And, hopefully that will be replicated, be more ambitious, maybe improve on the rate, improve on the expectation. And it's those kinds of things. It's sort of changing paradigms, I guess, in that sense.
And Tom, let me ask you some sort of bigger picture questions, just as we kind of conclude on getting to know you, which I know we were never going to do it justice in 20 minutes, but we've had a bit of a whistle stop tour. When you think about your end of your career, and when you think about when you look back on what you've done, what do you want to be able to? And I know you're a very humble guy, and you've already alluded to the fact that acknowledge that you're contributing to the overarching solution. But what do you want to be able to say about what you did?
I think really just to feel that I've lived my life with, to create something bigger than myself, I guess, which is probably what most people want, I'm sure. So nothing particularly outrageous, but really to feel I've been true to my values and, the purpose that I've sort of set out for myself at the beginning of my career, and that hopefully I've lived up to that.
Very sensible, very, very reasonable. Well, Tom, let's. In fact, we've almost nailed the 20-minute intro to you in terms of timing. So that never normally happens. So I'm pleased that we've kept to that. Let's maybe move on and ask you to please introduce the article. I think it was Simon Cleveland and his colleagues in Deloitte Insights in August 2023 that produced the article that we shared
Yes.
with you previously. Can you just start by giving our listeners a brief introduction to the piece, and then just perhaps pull out whatever the most sort of interesting, most salient points were for you in that article?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I thought it was a very interesting piece, really looking at some of the challenges that organizations are facing around really making sense of sustainability and that integration into the strategy, and the way that these organizations are operating. I mean, for me, that's the fundamental really that we should all be aiming for, regardless of what type of organization you're in. It's also quite challenging, and quite confusing. And I think the article does a very good job of sort of cutting to, what some of the complexity is for business leaders around all of this, and how the business as usual has slightly been turned on its head by these sort of different reporting standards and frameworks, as well as stakeholder expectations around sustainability, and really trying to understand what that means for those people, particularly in C-suite executive jobs, and how they are really going to have to get used to this new normal that we find ourselves in, or ultimately have a fairly challenging time. I was interested. What struck me particularly in reading this, and perhaps it's not surprising, is really, I think it's largely around reporting and data, which is, of course, hugely important. I've mentioned how important having these frameworks and standards are, and that clear set of expectations. But I think the sort of points that came through for me, one about the lack of direction and the challenges of ESG reporting being ever changing. Speaking for myself, it's been a couple of years for me that I've slightly been outside of that world, and it was my world for a long time. And even in those 2 years, things have changed enormously. So for business leaders trying to make sense of it all, I think that is an issue. But I think, that's one piece. I think the article, my take is that it's really talking about ESG largely as a compliance issue. And I think focusing on it as a compliance issue, you will never really realize the value for your organization if that is your mindset. But I think that stems from looking at it as a reporting issue. So there's sort of two sides of the same coin. Data, I mean, we could talk about data all day long, I'm sure. I mean, it's the fundamental. We need the data. You need it to report, you need it to measure progress, but it's easy to get completely hung up and spend a huge amount of time trying to finesse your data collection systems and reporting and all the rest of it. Maybe, depending on how you're resourcing sustainability, to the detriment of actually just getting on and doing stuff. Yeah, and then finally, the final point, which is really, I think, the most important point for all of us in a big macro sense, is the need for collaboration, which I feel very strongly about that. So,
Tom, there are so many questions to pull out of this, and I do want to sort of, I think where you are now with Carter Jonas and the work that you're doing there. I think I'd really like to peer into the application of some of these issues that were highlighted within the article, within your role, and within the context that you currently find yourself. But before we dive into that, you alluded to it there, the conundrum, if you like, at play within the sustainability space between compliance, reporting, measuring, and innovation, and getting on. And I think you described it perfectly, getting on and doing stuff. Like, where do you see, as somebody who's in the midst of it, I know right now, do you think that the balance has gone to, where do you think the balance lies at the moment for the agenda between the two?
I mean, I in a way, so obviously, Carter Jonas, we're an LLP, so we're slightly insulated from some of those reporting requirements. So the challenge I have, just I guess talking about strategy in the first place, is creating something which is ambitious and transformative for our organization, but isn't necessarily trying to be at the same level in terms of disclosure as our shareholder-owned peers and competitors. We want to be able to be ambitious for ourselves, for our clients, and for all of our stakeholders. But we need the right fit for us, which is trying to set a long-term plan on those most important issues affecting our business and affecting our clients' businesses, but without, as my American colleagues would say, without trying to boil the ocean around it. So I think for those working in, I guess, more corporate environments, there is a real challenge there, and there is increasing regulation around disclosure. There is as you put regulation in place, that creates some anxiety, I suppose is perhaps not the right word, but about quality of information, the audit process, and that side of things. So it is crucial to get that right. And I mentioned data, as the fundamental, but you've obviously got, I think as long as you're not looking as compliance as the ideal, but as the minimum mandatory, then you're probably going to be okay. And of course, the compliance is just the first step. Understanding how you're performing and then disclosing that information to your stakeholders is really the first step. You then got to keep trying to drive improvement and talking about improvement. But actually, the qualitative piece is as important as the quantitative. We need to talk about what's hard, to the point about collaboration. This stuff is super difficult. We all need to be sharing our experiences of what we've tried and what's working, what's not working. And actually, I think ambition, intent, hard to quantify, but actually that is, a hugely important part of this journey for everybody involved.
And Tom, out of interest, because it's a theme that keeps coming up, this notion of partnership, collaboration, etc. Like at CJ, are you actively looking to engage with competitors, with like supply chain organizations? Like, what? Just give us give us an insight into how an organization of the significance of yours like goes about approaching collaboration.
So we've just completed a piece of research working partnership with University College London, so UCL, who are not too far from our head office. We're really working together to try and understand what a green premium for commercial buildings looks like. So, speaking to different parties involved in that. But I think, just as a case in point, I think coming together with academic institutions to try and leverage our access to clients and our working experience, really, really key, as well as bringing their sort of the rigor and, their analytical skills to bear to create something that's really original and forward thinking. So I guess there's that side of things. And, I'm quite pro having conversations with peers and really trying to work together to create that change. But I guess more broadly, they're just thinking particularly about the built environment, the net zero carbon building standard, the pilot that was produced a few weeks ago. I mean, that really is a point of collaboration between lots of industry focused organizations, whether it's REBA, RICS, whoever. And actually, we need consistency and standards to work towards, and that's how you get them. But looking at our own operations, I think, for any business trying to address climate change, that scope 3 piece is really, really tricky. And the only way that we're actually going to be able to do anything with that is working with suppliers. But again, the data point, it comes back to understanding what is your footprint, where are your big impacts, and actually what does change look like. But it's a long-term process. But I think you can generally be reasonably confident that most of the businesses in your supply chain are also grappling with this. So having those conversations and coming together, I think, is really, really key. Having clear expectations, and trying to select your partners, your supply partners, on the basis of those shared goals, transparency, and as ever, access to data and information about your own impacts associated with those goods and services that you're buying into your organization.
Tom, such a clear and sort of expanded answer. Let me ask you, I want to go back to the beginning of your time at CJ and joining the business. What were the number one things that you looked at initially? Like, what were the key focuses for you at the beginning when you came in? Was it, you mentioned data, you mentioned measurement, was it really kind of understanding exactly how that was set up and how that needed to be improved upon in order to sort of get us at our benchmark? Or just give us a flavor of what was in your in tray, if you like, when you arrived.
Yeah, sure. I think really for me, the number one piece was around just understanding what does sustainability mean to CJ. I know we talked about this before, Charlie, but my basic philosophy is sustainability is about better ways of doing things, and therefore it's universally applicable. That everything you do or everything you buy is on a spectrum of being more or less sustainable. So how do you make sense of that? And there's a very well established sort of mature process out there to go and speak to stakeholders and really have those conversations. So just hearing from our clients, from our colleagues, from our partner organizations about what they expect from us, and what are the most important issues, and really just using that as a basis to create the strategy for the partnership, and then they're being able to set goals around that and tying into those sort of key longer term objectives, and trying to use goals and targets not as an end in themselves, but as a way to drive change and create change in the organization to sort of reach that desired future state. Say, what do you want the business to look like in 10, 15 years time? And actually, how are we going to put the right measures in place that will move us towards achieving that?
Can you, and again, Tom, I have to say your responses are so like eloquently, perfectly sort of timed. Your timing is beautiful as you deliver these responses. Let me ask you. So I think the article alluded to this as well, like the impact of C-level executives and their mindset, perspective, etc. When it comes to sort of, I guess as the article alluded to, like fully integrating sustainability into the fabric of an organization. Just touch upon, you mentioned the long-termism, if we call it that, thinking about CJ in 10, 15 years time. I think it's a fascinating kind of alignment or interesting reflection on your experiences within government and how, the short-term sort of approach to things was difficult. Tom, let me ask you, how do you, when you think about the work that you're doing and that you've done so far, like, can you just, again, it's really interesting to understand like the practical realities of your experience in the last couple of years. Like, what have been the biggest kind of obstacles or difficulties that you found in entering a new organization, developing an understanding and then developing a strategy and a direction for the coming years?
So I think, it's interesting working in sustainability, and you come into a business, you are obviously, there are pieces which you're creating which are new, so the strategy and all the rest of it, but a lot of it is actually working to influence what is already happening and often being done extremely well within an organization. So I think that in itself can be tough. So really for me, that's about building relationships with people within the firm and trying to work together to make sense of it. And largely that's just sort of presenting coherently their good work alongside all the other things which are happening. And it also requires an understanding, an operational understanding, and a whole business view, which actually there are probably not that many functions or people within the business that actually have to take that view, and a level of understanding and breadth from what is the policy around vehicle leasing? How do we pay people? What's maternity cover look like? Where do we buy our, sandwiches from? What are the carbon emissions from our cloud computing contracts? All these, so many different varied things that you have to bring together to try and understand. And that just takes time. But again, those relationships are really important. And then sort of once you understood that, there's obviously the fundamentals of data and reporting. I mean, I'm extremely lucky. I have some fantastic colleagues who've been doing a brilliant job with things like our carbon reporting, obviously meeting our compliance obligations. All our people data is really great, but it's sort of pushing into those new areas where we've maybe not thought about things. So particularly supply chain, we've just, for the first time, calculated the footprint associated with the goods and services that we're buying in as a business. Okay. That's been a significant bit of work. The auditor approved it, so I'm pretty happy about that. But then, that's sort of day one, really. You've got the information. What do you do with it? How do you make sense of it? How do you then operationalize it to try and make some sort of positive change in what's going on?
It's really interesting, and data has obviously been a key theme throughout this conversation. I just want to pick up on there, though, talking about possible obstacles or difficulties, and I'm not suggesting this is necessarily your experience at CJ, but yeah, people, coming in and essentially, people don't like change, do they? They don't like, to have to adapt necessarily, and there's that whole status quo. We've always done it this way, kind of analogy that comes through a lot with when people talk about adopting sustainability principles. Can you just talk to us about your approach to kind of internal communications regarding your work within sustainability within the organization, and perhaps just touch upon how you think somebody new coming into a role within the sustainability function of an organization can go about communicating most effectively the changes that they want to make?
Yeah, I mean, it is a challenge, and I think, like I said, it's about not necessarily business cases in a piece of paper with lots of numbers, but actually making making the case to colleagues for change, and the benefits around that. There's having those initial conversations with stakeholders is hugely valuable, because you can say, look, we've been interviewing clients. This is what they are struggling with. This is what they want from us. This is what they expect of us as an organization. That you're building up a sort of a body of evidence, if you like, that you can then take to colleagues to have that conversation. You're trying to make the case for change, essentially. You're not going to just turn up. If there are people who are reluctant to change, which is completely normal, very human thing, then they're not going to do it just because you're telling them they've got to. You need to show the value to them as individuals, to the business, to their own clients of doing that, and really just sort of work to get them on board. But I think that's about, like I say, it's sharing the information that you've gathered through the process of creating your strategy, through those conversations. I mean, and equally, what are your peers and competitors doing? Where are they on this journey? Do you want to be left behind? What sort of work do you want to be doing in future? I mean, we're quite lucky working in property, because I mean, particularly the built environment, its role in particularly climate change is very well understood, and there's a huge amount of evidence for that. We've got a pretty tough regulatory landscape around energy efficiency, performance, all those sorts of things, which are actually foremost in our clients' minds. So clients are proactively coming and speaking to colleagues about this. So there is an understanding on that side of things. But really, just try and make the case. Fundamentally, it's about communicating what's the benefit, I think, as with any change. I mean, you could just treat it like another change management program, ultimately.
Can you believe, Tom, that we've rattled through a 40-odd minute conversation already? It never surprises me how quickly these chats seem to go, especially with somebody with the degree of kind of insight that you're able to share with us. We always finish the show with our magic wand question, which I know I've mentioned to you before, but let me pose it again. Tom, if we were to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
Oh gosh, I mean, that's a tricky question. I did spend quite a long time thinking about it beforehand. I think my answer would be just probably the way that value and cost is understood, and indeed price by extension. I think a lot of sustainability is really about value, and actually how people understand that. Whether that is, you're investing in a sustainability program, what is the benefit that brings to the business? There's a lot of intangibles in there, and I think actually we need to get better at realizing that value can come in many different forms, and actually trying to price that in better and understand ROI in a fuller sense. I think that would really help to create change. I don't know how you do that. I don't really know what it looks like, to be honest, Charlie, but that would be, I think, probably top of my wish list.
Well, the beauty of the magic wand is the magic wand doesn't necessarily provide us with its insights, but it can certainly take on the task. Tom, let me ask you though, in terms of the point that you made there about value around sustainability, like give us a flavor. Like, what are those sort of underappreciated values? Do you think that most of us are missing when it comes to viewing the impact of integrating sustainability in our businesses?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot of coverage in the press, for example, about war for talent. I'm sure that talent attraction and retention is a top enterprise risk for most businesses. And actually, it's well covered. Speaking to young people, they want to work for a business that is purposeful, that is ethical, that is actually there to do more than simply make money for its shareholders or other stakeholders. So what is the value in being able to demonstrate that you are living up to those expectations, getting the best people in and holding on to them? Like, how do you cost that, for example? I mean, that's hugely important. I mean, particularly for professional services businesses like ours, our people are our means of delivering value to clients. They're the means that we generate income into the partnership. So that intellectual capital that is there inherent in our people is our number one resource. It's our most precious asset. It sounds, lots of people say it's very cheesy, but it's a cliche because it's true, right? So actually having the best people allows us to be the best possible business. And actually, if having a sustainability program that attracts people to want to come and work for us, there is a significant value on that. That's maybe not understood if you just do a classic kind of ROI analysis.
A very, very good practical suggestion, I think, for anyone out there looking at their sustainability programs and considering, what the likely return is to be. Tom, thank you so much for joining us this morning. That was again, I know a whistle stop tour, 45 minutes evaporates when we have these types of shows, but really fascinating to hear more about your journey, and I think it particularly interesting to hear about the challenges and the focuses that you have during your work at CJ, which sounds fantastic. So thank you so much for being so open and sharing those insights with us today.
My pleasure, Charlie. Really great to join you. Thanks for having me on the show.